Good. It's wonderful to see so many people, so many academic leaders, so many scholars from dozens of different academic institutions, both here and throughout American higher education, coming together to discuss issues of common interest from a variety of disciplinary perspectives and other perspectives as well. My name is Lee Strang, and I'm the director of the Chase Center, the host of today's event at The Ohio State University. I'm going to say a few words to introduce the Chase Center, then introduce the symposium, and then to thank some of our supporters. The Chase Center, like many of our institutions, arose to address two, in my view, related concerns. First, many Americans appear to lack the essential knowledge of our shared civic tradition. And second, we Americans have seemed to lose our capacity to discuss and debate with each other in a civil and productive manner. Together, these two causes have led to a worrisome polarization of American public life, and along with some other causes, a precipitous drop in public trust in American higher education. The Chase Center, like many other schools of civic thought in Ohio and around the country, is a response to these challenges, and responding to these challenges helps Ohio State respond to these challenges through its teaching, its research, and public programming on the core texts and great debates of the American civic tradition, along with cultivation of a community of an ethic of civil debate and dialogue. And today's symposium advances those commitments. Today's symposium has three complementary goals. First, it provides an opportunity for Ohio's nearly 24 schools of civic thought to come together, to share fellowship, and to learn from each other. Second, the symposium puts the leaders and faculty of Ohio Civic Centers into conversation with thought leaders from many fields throughout the university, including citizenship education and related fields. And third, the symposium is a catalyst for collaboration among our nearly 24 civic centers here in Ohio, and then also some other folks from throughout the country. Today's a conversation among colleagues, and so don't be hesitant to chime in and share tentative thoughts. Thematically, the panels address the future of American higher education and raise for each of us and for each of our institutions, how do we contribute in a positive way to the future of higher education in the United States? Before we begin our first panel's conversation with an appropriate title, let me pause to thank our symposium supporters. We appreciate the generous support of the Jack Miller Center, which, as many of you know, is a leading nonpartisan supporter of civic education in the United States. And I know Tom Cleveland is here. Tom, raise your hand. Thank you, Tom. And the Stanton Foundation, who through a generous grant has helped us support this and other public-facing endeavors. The Foundation's mission is to create a more informed citizenry by supporting innovations in civics like this one as well. So please join me in giving the Stanton Foundation So now to our first panel, which sets up our day's conversation, appropriately titled The Future of Higher Education. The moderator is Dr. Jeremy Fortier, who is, I want to just a short note of thanks. Jeremy has been an incredible architect of the conversations that we're having today, and I want to spend just a moment thanking Jeremy for his time and effort to bring the conversation together. So without further ado, the future of higher ed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Let me just first say, as a general matter about procedure through the day, my sort of principle and MO with these events is to give smart people a platform and get out of the way. So that's sort of how I hope to proceed as much as possible. And so I'll introduce our speakers briefly. Hopefully they can respond to each other a bit, and we can then incorporate questions from the audience and proceed with that format. On the topic of the future of higher education, let me say that Stephen Mintz and Chad Wellmon are probably two of the best qualified people in the country to discuss this, partly as experts in the history of the university and partly as people who comment regularly publicly about the potential future of the university. So if you haven't read Professor Mintz's recent essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education on what the futures of the university will look like, or his Substack essay on the applied liberal arts, you should. If you haven't, well, you will not yet have read Professor Wellmon's forthcoming book, After the University, Higher Education and the Future of Intellectual Work, but you should pre-order it from Johns Hopkins University Press and read his earlier book, Permanent Crisis, about the humanities in a disenchanted age. So I think they're really kind of ideal speakers to raise these questions for us about what the future of the university will look like. And so we're very honored and privileged that they're both here to speak to us today. And with that said, I suppose we'll proceed in alphabetical order in general, just because that's simplest. About up to 20 minutes for our speakers, just so that we make sure that there's time for Q&A, and then we will, we'll move ahead. Thank you, Professor Mintz.
I'm a historian, and so I am perfect at predicting the past. I can tell you who won World War II and never be wrong. But in terms of the future, I'm impossible. And yet, I think I know about the future of American higher education, and I can sum it up in one word: stratification. This week, my university got a gift from Michael Dell of $1 billion. At the same time, there were other announcements. Syracuse University is going to close 20% of all of its programs, 93 programs. Temple University has between a $37 million and $60 million structural deficit. It's experienced a 27% decline in enrollment in the last 5 years. The new school is laying off 15% of its workforce. Portland State's closing 19 departments. Ohio University, 16 departments. North Texas, 79 programs. That's stratification, right? The rich get richer, and everybody else is in big trouble. And so we face some big dilemmas. Even the elites are in trouble right now for a variety of reasons. Their endowments are viewed by legislators as piggy banks. The cutback in international enrollment, cutbacks in federal grant funding, these are devastating for universities like Columbia, that 25% of their budget comes from federal grants. They can't operate the same way they've operated in this new emerging environment. But however hard it is on them, it is much, much worse for regional publics, for urban publics, for liberal arts colleges, apart from the most highly endowed, and for community colleges. The future is occurring right around us, and it is ugly. Some of you may have read an article in the Washington Post this week about the University of Maine at Presqu'île. Students who are able to get a bachelor's degree in 22 weeks. Students who are able to complete 16 courses for credit in a month. And their accreditor has done nothing. We are creating a system, quote unquote, in which some degrees are going to have serious value and many degrees are going to have no value at all. And I could go on, right? We all know about predatory professional master's programs at many of our own universities that leave students poorer when they're finished than when they started. This is a crime, and we are allowing this to happen on our watch. So we can't blame it on somebody else. The real F word in higher education is faculty. And I'm convinced lots of the problem, lots of the blame lies with faculty members. In other words, it's us, and we need to look in the mirror. We need to decide what a college education is for. We need to decide whether our education will be rigorous and demanding or whether it won't be. You know, these things are utterly shocking to me, and I hope they're utterly shocking to you. So, we have several tiers. And ironically, I'm convinced that the tier that's going to do the best is the flagship campuses that are the more prestigious AAU level flagship campuses. We have much bigger faculty than the Ivies. We have more national merit winners than the Ivies. We have greater reach in terms of departments. We're going to do really well. Now, you may not get $1 billion here at Ohio State, but I can assure you, you are going to do way better than any other campus in the state. And students, I think, are already voting with their feet to get into campuses like yours and mine. The hierarchy of higher education is changing, and you are the beneficiary of that. I am the beneficiary of that. At the University of Texas, we get the top 5% of students in their graduating class. Those are wonderful students. Are they as polished as my former students at Columbia? No. Are they smart? Absolutely. Are they strivers? Absolutely. Right. They're just the kind of students you want to work with. But what this means is that if you're not at an institution like this one or mine, you're getting a second-tier education. This country, in the early 20th century, opened a new high school every day for 40 years. We democratized a middle-class childhood. And after 1960, we did the same thing with college. We transformed college from an elite experience into a mass, truly a democratic experience. And what we're doing now is we're retreating from that vision. And that is a crime, in my view. And we need to push back against that. Again, I'm the beneficiary. Many of you are the beneficiary of the changes that are taking place. But that's not right, right? Every student should have access to a quote-unquote poor man's Harvard. That was the vision of the 1960s. That was the vision into the early 1970s, but that vision has flailed before our eyes in our time. You know, I'm a historian. When I hear that Notre Dame Cathedral catches on fire after 700 years, that's our problem, right? Well, our version of the Library of Alexandria, our version of Notre Dame, is burning in front of our eyes, and we're not doing much about that. Every man for himself seems to be the mantra of today. Now, even at schools like mine, where we admit the top 5% of students in Texas, we have gated majors. You can't get into business. You can't get into engineering. You can't get into nursing and many other fields unless you surmount the gate. Typically, that means a 4.0 average your freshman year. Typically, it means that you completed calculus with an A. Otherwise, you do not get into these programs. So even at our quote-unquote democratic institutions, We've established barriers to talented students. So if you come from a uneven high school, you're in trouble. You may get into the University of Texas at Austin or maybe Ohio State, and you still can't take advantage of all the programs that it offers. This should be deeply disturbing to us. And then, of course, another big difference is access to high-impact practices. We all know what those are: freshman research experiences, access to internships, inquiry, project-based learning, maker spaces, and the like. We've got them. Other places don't have them. Fundamental difference in the quality of education. To me, this is, again, a terrible scandal. And so currently we're losing about one college a week to closure, but I think that the failure of Hampshire is going to open the door. Right up until now, it's been small religious colleges that have collapsed. But with Hampshire, I think we're beginning to see the beginning of colleges that you've heard of that can't be rescued any longer. I was an Oberlin undergraduate, and Oberlin will survive, but it's not exactly the same Oberlin that I went to. It's more like Antioch was back when I was an undergraduate. But Wittenberg, others, Hiram, I don't think they're going to survive. I mean, this should be deeply disturbing to everyone, right? This was a state of liberal arts colleges, and that whole infrastructure is about to collapse. And I don't think anybody cares. But it's a big loss because liberal arts colleges are the super ego of American higher education. And without them, then we'll teach like we do at UT Austin. My typical class is 400 students, but I do have small classes. The smallest class I've ever taught there is 40. It's not much of a resemblance to the education I had at Oberlin. When I taught at Columbia, the largest class I ever taught was 17 students. Different experience, right? This is awful, what's going on. So, what's the future of American higher education? I'm going to run through it very quickly. There are the luxury good universities. These are the Harvards, Princetons, Yales, Stanfords. They have plenty of money. They also include places like Amherst and Williams and Swarthmore. They will continue to give an education filled with mentoring, filled with high-impact practices. Then there'll be the imperiled traditional university, places like Rutgers, places like Temple, places you've heard of, right? And they're going to be struggling. They're going to have fewer and fewer programs for their students. They're still going to have a name brand like Syracuse, but they're not the same institution anymore. They're endangered. Then the multi-college university at my school is sort of like that. It's like medieval Europe at UT Austin. You have a president, but the real power lies with the lords, right? It lies with the law school dean, the engineering dean, the business school dean. They have immediate ties, direct ties to the regents. You don't mess with them. Business cut its enrollment from 9,000 majors to 4,000 because they wanted to be the #1 undergraduate business school. It worked. 5,000 students who wanted to be in the business school closed out of every class. and nobody cared, right? Because the lords had the power and the president, none. Okay. Then, next generation technical institutes. One pathway to success is to follow the MIT, Caltech, Georgia Tech model. Really focus on technology. In Texas, the University of Texas at Dallas has pursued that path. Don't emphasize the humanities, right? Don't even emphasize the social sciences. Make a total focus on STEM and particularly on engineering fields, and you'll get support. So that's a strategy that might work. Some of us might consider that excessively narrow, but it might work. Has worked for UT Dallas. Then, what I call the Applied Liberal Arts University. And the problem is most humanities faculty, certainly me and my colleagues, don't know what that world looks like very well. But I'll give you an example. One of my cousin's sons got a PhD in English at Chicago, top 3 program. Didn't want to teach, developed a lot of technology skills. He went to work for Netflix. He was put in charge of narrative design. He was responsible for telling screenwriters how to create narratives in particular genres. Now he teaches at Berkeley's Information School. Now he is part of a major AI startup, lives in San Francisco, makes a salary 10 times whatever you make, right? That's part of the future. AI, we may think, is a giant plagiarism machine. That's not how it works. There are philosophers, logicians, literature specialists who scrutinize its answers and teach it how to argue, teach it how to create a narrative, teach it how to write. Those people are central to how AI works. We're not training those people. That should be part of our job, right? These are the people who create the guardrails, right? This is not a trivial responsibility. This is super important. Then there's the competency-based university, Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire, University of Maine, Presqu'île. The average student at Western Governors gets a BA in 2 years. Come on. How any accreditor could allow that is beyond me. I graduated in 3 years. I had lots of AP credit. But come on. 2 years for a BA? This isn't serious education. Then a hybrid university, it's going to use a lot of technology, rely very heavily on AI as a substitute for faculty and advisors. I was an administrator at Hunter College, had 23,000 students. I had 4 full-time professional advisors. That's not slim. That's virtually non-existent, right? These are real problems. Okay. So what's the future of higher education? My answer is it's stratification. But that's the wrong direction for us to move in. And we have a responsibility to push back. We have to reassert a democratic vision of what higher education ought to be. Thank you very much.
Tremendous speech. Thank you.
Well, in contrast, I have a heap of hope coming for you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation. So I teach at the University of Virginia, and asking about the future of the University of Virginia, the future of the curriculum, not only at Virginia, but elsewhere, I think is a little bit like asking about the fate of Frankenstein's monster. The University of Virginia is a bureaucratically complex, large-scale enterprise with an operating budget of more than $5 billion. It is also an investment company, the University of Virginia Management Company, that manages an endowment of over $14 billion, a medical center with more than 12,000 employees, and almost $3.5 billion in annual operating revenue, including over $500 million in federal research contracts and grants, asterisk beside that, an athletics enterprise with 25 sports programs and a reported total revenues of over $550 million last year, a police force of 67 officers, a library and museum with numerous art, historical, and scholarly collections, including more than 5 million printed volumes, a collection of capital assets in the form of academic buildings, dorms, stadiums, office parks, a resort with an 18-hole golf course and a 6-hole par 3 course, very nice. My son and I, we fish at the golf course because it's very expensive to play on the par 3 golf course. And we have to do it after 6 when the regular attendees aren't there, though. Very good bass. An entertainment venue for everything from rodeos to Rolling Stone concerts, a licensing and venture group, a transportation system comprising a fleet of hundreds of buses, trucks, and cars, and incidentally, an institution of higher learning. Like Frankenstein's monster, UVA trudges on. A creature both beautiful and wretched, stitched together by historical accident and, I would say, earnest ambition. But for how long? Any effort to foretell the future of the university must reckon with the monstrosity that the university has become. And such a reckoning, I think, is particularly important if we want to understand how education and higher learning relate to this thing that we now continue to call a university. And since the question offered us was about the future of curricula as well, I'll say a curriculum is one way to describe this relationship that I'm asking about, thinking about between this monstrosity called university and higher learning or education. To ask what kinds of curricula universities will be positioned to provide in the future, then, is to ask about the relationship between the monstrosity and higher learning. From the classical Latin carrera, to run, curriculum is related to terms for running, a race, a course, a particular path. And when adapted by educational institutions, curriculum named a path laid out by a community of teachers to guide students through their learning. And like any reliable or trustworthy path, a curriculum required teachers who planned, who cleared, and who marked that path with purpose. It also required students who trusted those teachers to continue, at least trusted them enough to continue along the path. Now, a range of institutions, from schools, academies, monasteries, and universities, provided material support, the intellectual and moral conditions, and the political and social cover, as it were, for these communities of students and teachers who had gathered in the first instance out of common intellectual desires and shared interest in the disciplining and ordering of those desires. That is, a curriculum. A curriculum so understood, perhaps, as a set of shared practices and purposes cultivated and transmitted through communities of students and teachers, is, I would say, not an institution. There's a distinction there. And yet, curricula have always served as well as organizational features, making institutions internally navigable and externally legible. So the distinction I want to offer up here is that a curriculum names both some particular intellectual content related to practices and standards of excellence on the one hand, but a curriculum also names the institutional form given to that content. If this is more helpful, you can think of it as a distinction between practices and institutions. And I think one way to understand the history of the university as an institution is as a series of conflicts over curricula as intellectual content or practice and curricula as institutional form or organization. Conflicts between, on the one hand, the interests and values of communities of scholars and students within the university, and on the other hand, the interests and values of the university as an increasingly recognizable and powerful social institution. So an older example, for example, you might think of 13th century Paris. and the fights over which, how much, and in which order of Aristotle ought to be taught. And this pitted emerging scholastic scholars against the then entrenched powers in the theology faculty, more aligned directly and more immediately with the church. And one of the distinguishing features of the modern university, by which I mean simply the research university as it emerged in Germany and then the United States over the course of the 19th century, is the way in which these conflicts oftentimes hardened into contradictions. The way curricular content became untethered from or even alien to the administrative and organizational structures more broadly known as university curricula. In the modern university, that is, a curriculum has oftentimes named less a coherent educational path or set of shared standards of excellence and more an institutional and social function. Curricula organize and reproduce an institutional and social division of labor. Sometimes they name a coherent educational path. Another way to put this, in the bureaucratically complex, socially integrated modern university, curricula were used as administrative organizational fixes for what I would argue are, and always were, institutional problems. Consider two kind of meso-level examples. First, the humanities. In 1898, Heinrich Rickert, philosopher, late 19th century, early 20th century German philosopher, and several of his philosophy faculty colleagues. Now remember, of course, in the 19th century, the philosophy faculty contained everything that was not theology, medicine, and law. So Rickert and several of his colleagues at the University of Freiburg met to discuss the possibility of organizing a scholarly society as what they called as a counterpart to the one natural scientists had already established almost 80 years earlier, the Freiburg Society of Physical Scientists. Now, at that first gathering of scholars from, as Rickert reports, theology, jurisprudence, law, philosophy, political economy, and also what would become the social sciences, the question of nomenclature arose. Whereas the biologist, chemist, geologist, and physiologists never doubted what bound them together as, quote, men of the natural sciences, wrote Rickert, those gathered that day did not immediately know what common activity gave their group its coherence, though they presumed that there's got to be one since we're not part of the only group that already exists. True, we agreed on the term, as he put it, the Society for the Science of Culture, but the only reason no one objected is that no one had something better to propose. It was this continued lack, as he put it, not just of a meaningful name, but also of a shared concept of their common methods, their common interests and tasks, that Rickert's colleagues invited him to address in the Society's first lecture, where he proposed the name that stuck, at least for a few years. He proposed the Nicht-Naturwissenschaften, the not natural sciences. And you can see why it didn't necessarily stick, not just the German. Like many of his contemporaries, Rickert helped establish not only what more than a century later seems like an intractable opposition between the natural sciences and the humanities, and perhaps the human sciences more broadly, but also a canon of underlying distinctions. Nomothetic and ideographic, universal and particular. Nature as the realm of invariant laws and necessity, and culture as the realm of freedom and spontaneity, facts and values, is and ought, universalism, constructivism, necessity, contingency, objective, subjective, quantitative, qualitative. All of those sedimented into this concept, but then very quickly, on both sides of the Atlantic, sedimented and became institutionalized in something that I would argue is called the humanities, which was not first institutionalized in the United States as an institutional category until the 1930s, but in large part served a similar function, the not natural or physical sciences. The humanities from the institutional birth in late 19th century and early 20th century on both sides of the Atlantic emerged as an institutional function where the questions or perhaps anxieties about meaning, morals, and whatever else the natural and physical sciences couldn't resolve were cordoned off, contained. This, of course, conveniently liberated the natural sciences from the burden of any such responsibilities. My point here is institutional inertia as curricular category is something we've had in universities for quite some time. And I think you could tell a similar story about general education, especially the emergence of general education in universities across the United States around the same time, the first third of the 20th century. In this case, the problem was the modern university itself. And general education programs, first at Columbia, and then proliferating across colleges and universities in the United States, were proposed as solutions to all the damage that the rise of the research university has supposedly wrought. This was the way to fix the demise of the classical American college and its fixed curriculum, the blight of research, the bureaucratic rationality and avarice of the American university and their entrepreneurial presidents, and the loss of the so-called unity of knowledge. Yet in the end, most general education programs, I would argue, largely amounted to administrative fixes that fit just right within the existing structures of the prevailing institutional norms of the research university. For all the clamor of the restoration of the college by means of general education, noted the editors of the New Republic in 1922, amounted to, quote, adding 6 credits in Plato or Milton, 4 in surveying or stock judging, 6 more in calculus, 4 in botany or music, the total sum to equal 1 AB, end quote. The proper unit of measurement for the value of a general education turned out to be the same as that used to determine the value of professional training and to approve the university's financial efficiency, the credit hour. The attempts to counter the bureaucratizing, commodifying effects of the research university begot ever more components of the institution, more curricular categories, more programs, more devices. The educational machinery of the new university remade everything in its own image. Even the research university's most confident critics could not resist the allure of administrative solutions. In 1920, Amherst president Alexander Michaeljohn, one of the most eloquent critics of the research university, presented a curriculum proposal to his trustees that he argued would rehabilitate what he called the college's fragmented curriculum. His solution? He proposed I just have to laugh. His proposal was to split Amherst into a junior college and a senior college, creating a dual institution, each with its own curriculum. Of course, the junior college would be wholly dedicated to general education. The catastrophe of the modern university, he thought, could not be undone, but perhaps it could be compensated for by more organization and more institution. My point is simply this: institutional inertia is a powerful thing, and that's all I got about the future of the university. This monstrosity that we've created will lumber on, accumulating whatever functions, serving whatever needs the labor market, the state, society demands of it, doing whatever necessary to just keep going, all the while calling it higher education and reimagining it as curricular innovation. And the university, like Frankenstein's monster, can't help it. It's too big, does too many things, monopolizes too much of our attention, our love, our concern, and our time. Universities will provide whatever curricula serves their interest. But I think we can learn from Victor Frankenstein, the creator, whose pride, self-regard, and avarice tethered him to his creature, drove him to the ends of the earth in this projection of himself. But he needed to let go. And I think that's why I titled my new book After the University. We can talk about that.
So let me just adopt the following format, which is that I'll ask the Professors Mintz and Wellmon if they have any questions or responses for each other. If you have a question of your own, you might raise your hand so that mic runners can see where they will be going once we get there. But first, let me ask if either of you would like to respond to each other's remarks.
Sure. I found your remarks about curriculum really essential, because what curriculum is about is what is college for? Is it a way station on the way to adulthood? Is it a Club Med experience before you become a full-time worker? Is it a pathway to a job? You know, this is the question that our universities need to ask themselves. Now, my answer is it needs to be a bit of all of those. It does need to be more self-conscious about the vocations that our students are going to enter into. But it also needs to form professionals, to give them a professional identity. It needs to instill a rich interior life, to cultivate aesthetic sensibilities, ethical awareness, historical consciousness. But these are not questions we typically ask of our universities, and the result is a curriculum that a smorgasbord, totally fragmented, built around isolated disciplines that do not speak to one another. This, in my view, is an abomination. It is compromising everything that we believed about knowledge for the last 2,000 years, that it needs to be a more integrated endeavor. It needs to address fundamental problems, social problems, yes, but also personal problems. There's a line by the classicist Daniel Mendelssohn that is my mantra. When your father dies, your accounting degree will not help you process the experience. Right on.
In Germany, we would do this. I don't know if that means anything. I'll turn. I think
Good.
Turn it over. I think.
Good. So yeah, if there's a question, just raise your hand, and the mic runners will run over.
Hello. Thank you both. I guess I was wondering about a possible tension in both the remarks. The latter speech was about the development of curricula and other elements of the university that are driven not by any notion of the purpose of the university to create this monster. The opening of Mr. Mintz's speech was about the closing of programs, which I'm pretty confident is not being done sensibly, but on the other hand, I don't know if the number of programs is a good measure of the sensibility of a university. Some of that could be very positive to clear away things that are not actually responsive to the mission of the university. That is to say, I wonder if some of this destruction, whether intentional or by other means, some of that could be conceived of, or some of that could be positive in some way. Again, I don't want to say that in a naive way, but it's certainly not the solution to the future of the university to grow the university, to have more diversity of programs per se. So those are some thoughts I was wondering if you could respond to.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, and this is perhaps we might disagree, but maybe not. I think one of the original sins of the democratic dream of the university, by which I mean Clark Kerr in the 1960s and the California Master Plan, which on the one hand was wholly dedicated to increasing what Kerr and his colleagues called accessibility, and later they added excellence of a sort. But also simultaneously, as a matter of practice and institutional reality, unending growth. The only way to legitimate, but also to serve what I think were very good aspirations on the one hand, was the maximization of growth, but contained by, your term, hyperstratification. The California Master Plan was the model not just of a democratic public education system, it was the model of a democratic, highly stratified plan. What Kerr and his colleagues at the UCs, what they negotiated, this was the plan that would, by 1975, California's population was to increase by a factor of X, something big, I'm not sure what it was, I can't remember. What they negotiated was basically to maintain the enrollments of UC Berkeley and UCLA basically at steady state, which they did at between 25 and 30,000, right? This is at a time of crazy population growth, supposed commitment to hyper accessibility, and, as you can guess, what carried the plurality of that burden? Community colleges, completely underfunded and overburdened. So I think when we talk about the demise and all this stuff in closing, I would want us also to recognize that the democratic vistas of the 1960 vision was highly stratified, was committed to the flourishing of a very particular kind of institution and a very particular kind of student as consumer, a term not invented by Reagan, but a term used and peddled by Kerr himself even before Congress. So,
The departments that are being closed are not the departments of vinoculture or gaming, right? They are classics departments. They are religious studies departments. Some are, of course, wholly political, women and gender studies, or African American studies or Latino studies. But a lot of the programs that are being closed are programs that you and I would value deeply, particularly foreign language programs. And a university is just not a university without those programs. And it really doesn't matter how many students are taking those courses. It's just not a university. It's not committed to the universality of knowledge any longer. And further, universities have to grow. Neuroscience is a new field. Machine learning is a new field. They have to grow over time. And this is, of course, going to feed into the stratification that Chad and I have talked about, because you can't study those programs at many institutions, or if you can, you're really not studying with an expert in those fields. So this is why I worry about closure. This is not about creating more integrated humanistic programs like I favor. This is the exact opposite. It's about eliminating crucial elements of expertise.
Thank you guys for your very thoughtful and provocative comments, and I mean those two to go together. So Steve, and I want to put you guys in conversation to some degree. One of Steve's points was many universities are closing. One reason is because of reduced demand. And you can think of there being reduced demand, and you hear hints of this in your remarks, for two basic reasons. One reason is because the cost is too high, and another reason is because the return, however we define return, is too low. So it could be both of those. Putting aside whether the cost is too high and ways to remedy that, I think there are theoretically plausible but maybe not practically possible ways to remedy the cost is too high. Just focusing a little bit on the return being too low, one reason why somebody who's a fan of the humanities might think that Americans think the return is too low is because Americans have lost faith in the ability of education to form people, and they think that education is solely about remunerative professional training, which I disagree with that position, but I think it's a widespread position. Another reason why an American family or student might think of higher education as not providing a good return is because even if theoretically education can provide a great, well-forming education for a young person, American universities as currently constituted, including some of the departments and programs that you mentioned, don't do a good job at that. And this is where I go over to to the other remarks by Chad, one implication, I think, of Chad's remarks is that there's nobody in current universities, this is the Frankenstein, who has care of the formation of the young people who come in to our universities as young human beings, young American citizens. So if I'm reading an implication of Chad's remarks correctly, then would that be an explanation why Americans are seeing a relatively low return on their investment, because there's nobody in the university whose job it is to say to my son or daughter, or to a young man or a young woman, you come to me and we're going to open up your horizons and make you a well-formed, a better formed individual.
I mean, they're right, aren't they, in most places? Yeah, no, I think they are. But my answer would be, in the first instance, a pretty materialist one, which is to say that, so at UVA, so I've taught at UVA for quite some time. I spent 6 or 7 years leading this reform of general education across the university. It's now required, everybody does it. And about a year and a half into this process, that had become brutal, like faculty meeting after faculty meeting of yelling and arguing, but it was also beautiful. I mean, we were finally, my whole point was a curriculum is a claim about ought, what students ought to learn, what we as scholars value, right? It's not simply functional, despite the fact that that's what it has been for 70 years at UVA. So people disagreed with that. But we worked it out over 7 years. And, we've got categories, we've got fancy names and all the stuff that help students navigate it. But the thing that mattered were the material conditions of our general education program. The classes, and this is at a public state university, a very wealthy one, right? It probably fits in, $14 billion endowment, so I want to acknowledge that. The class sizes are capped at between 30 and 35 students. There's a percentage of, it's taught overwhelmingly by full-time faculty, tenure track faculty. There's a percentage of the postdocs that can be allowed to teach University of Chicago. If you know anything about their general education program, that's why that percentage is in there. So in my mind, the care, the attention, the concern is all about the relationships between teachers and students. And what we fought for, I think we did a lot of other things, but in the first instance, what I understood our task to be was to exact commitments from our dean and then from the provost, and they had to go out and raise the money and get the money to create the material conditions in which we could afford the possibility for the types of relation, care, and concern that I think is crucial to education. The content of it is the content of our scholarly and disciplinary lives as teachers and scholars at UVA. But the conditions of possibility for it are capping out at 30 students, 35 students, integrating advising with these year-long required courses with full-time faculty members who have to be the advisors. I mean, as you can understand, not every faculty member wants to do that, but it's now part of our hiring process at UVA. So that, I know that might be a rather oblique answer, but it's one that I know, but also theoretically, that's also how I understand a curriculum. It's about the institutional and material conditions of possibility for those types of relations that you're talking about. And, because the first thing we did was this huge data analysis of the first 2-year experience of our undergraduates. UVA has always prided itself on offering a liberal arts education at a big state university. And we found that the average class size in the first 2 years of our students was 100 plus. This is a bunch of bullshit that they are telling everybody. And so when that's how I kind of think of it.
I had the great opportunity of teaching for many years in Columbia's core curriculum, and to me, it is the platonic ideal of a lower division undergraduate education. There's a class called Contemporary Civilization, that is from Plato to Freud, right? There's masterworks of literature from Homer to Virginia Woolf. And then there's masterworks of music, masterworks of art, and frontiers of science. And I not only had a chance to teach in it, but I ran the training seminar for the graduate students who taught as part of that program. And if you were in that program, you met 4 hours a week, 2 hours on pedagogy and 2 hours on content, working with an outside expert on the subject, because everyone is teaching texts that they are not experts in. And you are in a room with the leading faculty members at Columbia. That is Gayatri Spivak from the English department, Andrew Delbanco from American Studies, Mark Lila, others who you've heard of. And then there's the outside people. Max Frankel, he was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times in the 1960s and 1970s. Right? These are the people who are spending 4 hours a week, not because they have to do it, not because it pays off for their own education, because they're dedicated to giving their students something special. Now, why does Columbia do that? Now it's a product of inertia. Alumni view it as the distinctive feature of the Columbia brand, but it was originally adopted because Columbia had the most fragmented campus you could imagine. Didn't have colleges or houses or even dormitories like Yale, Harvard. The unity of the campus came from the curriculum. It came from a shared educational experience. And we, you and I, need to embrace that idea. Our flagship campuses, our research ones, are the most fragmented institutions there are. We need to give these students a shared intellectual experience.
So first of all, thank you. This was a great conversation. Steve, I actually want to push you a little bit on stratification looking at institutions, because I think we should also talk about stratification in terms of faculty, right? I mean, my own experience moving from faculty at Johns Hopkins to be a dean in the Cal State system, from the best faculty to, let me just say, given the faculty union and demands from the system, I was literally taking people off the sidewalk to staff mandated classes, right? There was no quality control when you were ramping up or ramping down. You put in the classroom, the job of dean is to deliver the curriculum, right? And that, I talk too much about operationalizing, but that particular role, particularly when there's a strong faculty union, means that curriculum is fine, the institution is fine. What is actually happening in the classroom gets lost in this conversation. And I'm going to add one other thing, which is a degree like kinesiology, right? Which is basically the curriculum for that is gen ed, an anatomy class, and pickleball. Okay, and this is at one point in time the 13th most biggest major in the country, right? It was created to bring academically not particularly prepared young women into the university, right? This is not for category formation. This is for tuition dollars backed by federal loans, right? And so the number of universities, not top universities, that stayed afloat because of kinesiology is substantial. When I see that kind of contraction, I'm not so sad about it, because these women have incredible numbers of loads. So let's say, I mean, I appreciate your platonic ideal, and yet the reality on the ground is grittier, and, you know, in some ways, perhaps this contraction is good for us.
Let me push back a little bit. My sense is that there have never been better faculty members at every institution on the face of this country. The terrible job market has had a remarkable effect. At community colleges, you have published scholars now, right? Because you don't get an academic job unless you are super good. You know, whether I could get an academic job with my graduate school record in today's climate, not at all clear to me. I remember a year at Yale, the best job that a male student got, this is when it was probably the top history department, was a Nebraska Lutheran. That was Ben Sachs, right, who we've all heard of. That wasn't the kind of job Yale students were expecting, but it meant Nebraska Lutheran got a really top scholar. That's pretty cool, right? Now, I do think that we're training people way too narrowly, that we need much more interdisciplinary training. But in terms of smarts, every student is encountering really impressive faculty, no matter where. But the material conditions under which they're teaching, totally different. The student selectivity, totally different. The level of high school preparation, totally different. And, you know, you can be a great scholar, but you need to work with students who are very unevenly prepared, and you're often not ready for that.
I want to make sure we get two more questions, so Michael, sorry. Yeah.
So I guess I want to comment on the ratio between grief and introspection here. So
Grief?
well, we exist in a market, right? And our students, our alumni, our donors, they're all responding to the goods that we provide, the preparation that we offer. I mean, you can make a compelling argument that Hampshire College was euthanized because it did not have a major, it did not offer degrees, it couldn't enroll students, it couldn't attract donors, it didn't provide an education that was seen as valuable. So I suppose there is a sense of there, but I think the call to action is how do we function within this market? How do we justify our continued existence? How do we bring the American public to us and to see us as valuable? So I guess, why should we continue to exist? And how do we make that case to the American public? So not necessarily focusing on where we were, but focusing on what do the public want us to be? How do you see kind of the tension there between maintaining who we were versus becoming who we need to be?
I think there's a lot. I have a lot of different ways to go that I would want to respond to that. One, just as an aside almost, I think publics are created. They don't simply exist, and so they have to be articulated and brought to bear. But we could talk about that afterward. And this is where I think I perhaps do differ from Steve, because it might not have sounded like it, but I find this to be a very propitious moment. Writing this last book, called After University, for me was, it was a catharsis, it was a liberation, because I felt like Victor Frankenstein following this image of affection. I grew up in rural North Carolina, one of 7 kids, nobody went to college, my parents didn't, so I'm like the poster kid of what the American university can do in a lot of ways. And so I had to work through that. But I'm at the point now where, on the one hand, the kinds of goods that I think I value and I know lots of other people value are not simply market goods. And I no longer have faith that the university is the only place that can sustain, cultivate, and create the conditions of possibility to share those goods. And so, not to say that sometimes that people, like my friends you're just an Italian futurist from the 1920s, you're just accelerationism, you just want to destroy everything. And, are you Musk or Thiel or who are you? And So I don't have the grief bound up with that because I see all these possibilities, the programs, the communities that are emerging adjacent to, tangential to, outside of, alongside the university for those who actually care about, call them internal goods, as opposed simply to the external goods that the university's been chasing for the past 200 years. So I'm actually kind of disengaged from how can universities defend themselves and make their case to the market. And I'm like, I'm gonna go do what Zena Hitz is doing and start the Catherine Project and all these kinds of other things which are full, abundant, and just radiant, the kind of glorious communities that are being built outside or alongside the universities. That's a different response, and we could talk about more direct response about institutionally, but that's the one that I would at least kind of in contradict, maybe not, but in somewhat kind of contradistinction to Stephen might want to emphasize.
Here's my view, which you can feel free to disagree with. Universities should be about professional identity formation. We are producing future professionals. A doctor is not a plumber. A doctor is not a technician. Any really good doctor is an ethicist, a therapist. They have great psychological insight. And it's not just preparing doctors. It's about preparing attorneys. It's about preparing all kinds of diverse professionals. And we need to sell the public that that's what we're about. We're not just about technological skills. We are about creating well-rounded professionals. I don't think we do a very good job of it right now, but I think that that is a mission that the public could actually understand, accept, and maybe even embrace.
But
30 seconds.
isn't that the whole problem? Like the complete collapse in trust in professionals? Is it completely inextricable from everything that you've talked about? We're just going to reassert and reclaim what we've been claiming we've been doing for 150 years. That's been the whole mantra. We create professionals. Like, really? Like, I mean,
That's what I believe.
I love it. Thanks so much. Thanks to both panelists. And I wish we could.